welcome back to the MMA Training Bible's Guide to Peak Performance. So just a quick little recap. In the very first section, we introduced you to our whole approach here to helping you design an individualized and periodized training plan. And then we started to get into it in session 2. We focused on taking you through the process of scheduling the big training phases across your fight plan. And then in the last session, we taught you how to forecast training volume and intensity across your whole fight plan. And here we're going to apply in this session, session 4, some very important periodized concepts. We're going to talk about planning training subphases and training weeks. And then we're almost there because in the last session, session 5, we're going to get down to the basics and we're going to finish off this plan. We're going to teach you how to program individual training sessions. So welcome to session 4, planning training subphases and training weeks. Now, before we dig into the workshop aspect of this session, we have to touch on a few key concepts. And the first is that of training difficulty. The second is called load planning. And the third one is one you've probably heard before, training subphases. Now, after this, I'm going to take you through the step-by-step workshop approach for scheduling your training subphases across your fight plan. But we really need to make sure that we understand these concepts because you're going to need them when you're building your own individualized and periodized fight plan. So this is exactly what we're going to cover here. First, the first key concept is concept 1, that's that of training difficulty. Then we're going to talk about key concept 2 and load planning, and then we're going to go on and talk about the third concept. And it really is composed of 4 different types of subphases. We're going to introduce you to those, and then we're going to get into this interactive workshop after that. Okay, so the first concept that we need to know about in order to program training subphases is that of training difficulty. And this probably looks familiar. We talked a bit about training difficulty when I introduced you to the fight plan template so long ago. But now it's time to dig deeper, so let's dig into it. Now, training difficulty, it simply refers to how difficult you perceive a training session to have been. For example, think back to the last resistance training session you had. If you perceived that it was very hard, what made it harder than other sessions that you've had? Was it because you did more sets, or was it because you added more weight, or maybe you completed more repetitions, or maybe you changed your rest periods, or maybe you did new exercises, or maybe it was your second session of the day? Now, I'm hoping you're starting to see and understand what I'm talking about here. Training difficulty can be influenced in many different ways, and most of them are controllable. And we want to make sure that we're planning our training difficulty in advance of our workouts to ensure that we have an optimal adaptation to training. That is, we're not overtraining and we're not undertraining. And this level of planning, it's done at the level of the training subphase. And remember, a subphase, it's just a grouping of training weeks. Now, some of this may sound familiar from the lecture on periodization, and I simply wanted to reemphasize here that we need to be manipulating training difficulty across our entire fight plan. And again, this is first done at the level of the subphase. Now, the training difficulty of a training week, it can range from very low. That's when you're working in, let's say, a recovery week, which are very important. And they can range from medium to high to very high levels of training difficulty. So in this example, we're looking at a training subphase that features very low levels of training difficulty in week 1, a low level of training difficulty in week 2, with a medium level of training difficulty in week 3, followed by a large reduction in week 4. Now, as I said, there are so many ways to manipulate training difficulty across these weeks, and I really can't tell you exactly how to increase your level of training difficulty because it depends upon where you're at right now. But most of the ways involve applying the principle of overload. For example, by increasing the number of sets or repetitions, or changing the rest periods, or increasing the sessions per week or per day. And of course, you need to remember to follow your progression guidelines that we covered in the Science of MMA lectures. You know, when you're increasing the training load, that's say weight and resistance, you can use the 2 for 2 rule, which states that when you can perform 2 repetitions over the goal in the last set on 2 consecutive workouts, weight should be added in the next workout. And you can also use the quantity of load increase, which says that you should increase the load by 2.5 to 10%. So that's the first important concept that we need to grasp before we can really dig into our training plans and building them. Now, the next concept that I want to talk about is called the load planning. And after we just covered the training difficulty discussion, I think it's going to be immediately apparent. Now, load planning refers to the ratio of work weeks to recovery weeks. It's really, the practice of altering training difficulty over a subphase. And remember, a subphase, again, it's simply a collection of training weeks that are grouped together with altered training difficulty across them. So let's look at the example on the far left here. So here we're looking at a 1-to-1 loading plan, and it features 2 training weeks in total. So you train with some difficulty in week 1, then you take what amounts to a recovery week in the second week. Now, the notion of a recovery week built into training is one of the most important but most often neglected aspects of training, especially in MMA. So if you're like most fighters, you probably have never taken a recovery week. But assuming you're training hard, the recovery week is very important. Now, the 1-to-1 loading plan is useful for beginners or when you need to dissipate a lot of fatigue because it gives you one recovery week after you've had one hard training week. And so in this case, there simply isn't very much time to build up too much fatigue with this sort of loading plan, so it's pretty good for that. Now, we also have a 2-to-1 loading plan, and that simply features 2 progressively difficult training weeks followed by a recovery week. And again, these subphases, they're useful to incorporate at the beginning of a fight plan or when you're trying to dissipate some fatigue. And we have other types of loading plans. We have a 3-to-1 loading plan, and that's probably the most common. It features 3 progressively increasing difficulty training weeks followed by 1 recovery week. And so I'm going to teach you how to use a combination of these loading plans across your fight plan. So you don't need to worry too much about them, but you do need to understand what they are and how they're designed. The last concept that I want to introduce you to is that of the subphase, which we've already spoken about partially. Now, as I previously said, a subphase, it's just a grouping of training weeks. But what I didn't talk too much about is that different subphases have different purposes. Now here at the MMA Training Bible, we use 4 different types of subphases in our fight plans, and each has a different role to play. We use developmental subphases, we use shock subphases, we use taper subphases, and we also use transition subphases. And I'm sure from the titles that you can probably guess what each one is for and when it's used, but I'm going to go into a little more detail in each one so we're on the same page. Okay, so let's start with the developmental subphase. So here, it's an example of a 3-to-1 loading plan, but we also use a 1-to-1 loading plan and 2-to-1 loading plan as developmental subphases as well. Now, the key feature of the developmental subphase is a steady and slow rise in the training difficulty across the training weeks, followed by a recovery week, and that's very important. And again, you can manipulate training difficulty across these weeks in many different ways. So let's say you're focusing on aerobic oxidation across this subphase. Maybe in week 1, you perform one workout, let's say 4 to 5 intervals of 5 minutes on and 2 minutes off. You could increase the training difficulty in week 2 by simply doing that workout twice. You could further increase the difficulty in week 3 by reducing the rest down from 2 minutes to 1 minute. And that's how simple this can be. But again, the key point here is that you are just making little alterations to increase the training difficulty, and it's always followed by a recovery week at the end of the subphase to dissipate fatigue. If you don't have that, you're increasing your risk of overtraining. Now, the next type of subphase that I wanted to talk more about is the shock subphase. So here again, we're looking at a 3-to-1 loading plan, but the big thing that I want you to notice is the large increase in training difficulty in week 3. So the purpose of the shock phase is to literally provide a physiological shock to the body in order to encourage a greater adaptation. Again, there are many ways to achieve this. For example, you could achieve this by adding a few training sessions or keeping the current number of sessions you have and increasing the number of sets in your resistance workouts. and maybe the number of intervals that you're doing in your endurance workouts. Again, there are so many ways that you can achieve this, but it really is up to you to decide what represents a reasonable bump to your current training level. Of course, I'll give you lots of suggestions as we get into that last section of how to program and implement individual training sessions. Now, the last thing that I wanted to mention about these shock subphases is that although they provide a great stimulus for adaptation, they cause a lot of stress and can very rapidly lead to overtraining if you use them too often. For this reason, they should always be followed by a recovery week, and you want to use them sparingly across your fight plan. But don't worry, I'm going to show you exactly where I think you should be incorporating these shock subphases when we get into the interactive portion. Okay, let's talk about the taper subphase, but actually first let me orient you to this figure here. So on the left side, we're looking at a modified developmental subphase that we use towards the end of a fight camp. It's modified because it uses 4 progressively increasing weeks of training difficulty with no recovery week. Now, ordinarily this is a big no-no. The only reason I built it this way is because it's followed by the taper subphase, and that features 2 weeks of very large reductions in training difficulty. Now, the purpose of the taper subphase is to maintain training intensity but drastically cut training volume in order to dissipate fatigue and ultimately bring about a peak in your performance for the fight. So this is what a typical taper subphase looks like. And again, we're going to work together to schedule them in your fight plan. Okay, let's talk in a little more detail about the transition subphase. Again, this always comes after the taper and your fight. At this point in the fight plan, your focus needs to shift to recovery. That includes recovery from any injuries that you might have picked up during the fight, and of course, any injuries you might have picked up from previous training. And also it includes a priority of dissipating all the fatigue that is accumulated along your whole last fight plan. Now, the transition subphase typically lasts 3 to 6 weeks. It's longer and longer plans, and it's shorter and shorter plans, and it may have to be extended if you pick up an injury, as I mentioned. So here is an example of 4 weeks of transition. And you can see you want to start out with a very low level of training difficulty and gradually increase it as the weeks go by. You should be working with lowered training volume and intensity and avoid any sport-specific or MMA-specific training. Now, think of this as a time to be physically active, and you want to also do activities that you like, that you don't get to do very much, maybe rock climbing, hiking. It's really up to you. Now remember, this is a time of mental and physical recovery, and you need both if you're going to immerse yourself in another fight plan, which in what amounts to maybe the next few weeks or so. So the transition is very, very important. Okay, so now it's time to work on our individualized fight plans. We're going to take you through this workshop, so make sure that you have yours handy. So first, our approach here is we're going to schedule subphases for the transition, which should last 3 to 6 weeks. Next, we'll schedule the taper subphase, which features 2 peaking weeks. Then we'll schedule the fight camp subphase, which always features a shock subphase over the first 4 weeks of the fight camp, followed by 1 developmental subphase over the 4 weeks before the taper. And the long plans will use a combination of developmental and shock subphases during the general preparatory phase, and then we use a combination of developmental and shock subphases for the fight-specific phase otherwise. Okay, so let's go ahead and bring up our example and take you through this process. Okay, to save a little bit of time, I've gone ahead and filled in all the subphases and training weeks and training difficulty across the fight plan, and I'm going to walk you through what I've done. So the first thing that you should do is label the training weeks by number from left to right. So let me zoom in here to give you a little view. I'll go right here, that's good. So what you see here is this is the training weeks, and I've simply labeled them by number from left to right. Here's 1, 2, 3, 4. We can scroll all the way over to the end of the fight plan. You can see in total there's 18 weeks in this short fight plan. So this is going to be pretty useful when you're creating individual training session plans and you need to precisely refer to a specific subphase and training week. You can tell exactly where it is based upon this numbering, and we're also going to label the subphases in a minute. Now, make sure you place the number to the left of the box, as you're going to want to save a little bit of space to write the name of the type of subphase in the training week that you're using. Okay, so I recommend that you pause the video and number that up as I've done, because I'm going to assume you're doing this as we're going, and I'm going to move on to the next phase. So let's do that. Okay, so next is the transition. So after this, you want to assign the last 3 weeks of your fight plan to the transition subphase. Now, the black line below, it's the training difficulty line, which starts out very low and progressively increases to a medium level of training difficulty. This should look familiar as it relates to what we covered in Key Concept 3 when I showed you the different types of subphases. And again, I recommend that you pause the video now and label up the transition subphase in the training weeks and draw the training difficulty line as I've done, as I'm going to go on to the next section. Okay, let's talk taper. You should schedule a 2-week taper subphase next and label each of the weeks as peaking weeks, as that's what they're designed to do. Now, you'll also notice that the training difficulty drops from high in the first week of the taper to about low in the second week. And again, you can see the training weeks are labeled PEAK for peaking. Now again, you should pause the video now and complete this section as we go along before we move on here. But I'm gonna keep on going. I'm gonna assume that you're doing this stuff. All right, let's adjust over here to the fight camp. Now, the first 4 weeks of the fight camp should be assigned a shock subphase with a 3-to-1 loading plan. Now, the first 3 weeks feature a very high level of training difficulty, followed by a recovery week with a very low level of training difficulty. The last 4 weeks of the fight camp should be assigned a developmental subphase with a 4-to-0 loading plan, featuring a gradual increase in training difficulty and no recovery week. Now, there's no recovery week here because we're entering the taper, which in my opinion would provide enough recovery from this difficult period of training. Now also, the reason why we place the shock phase at the beginning of the fight camp is that we want to hit you hard and bring about a physiological adaptation that will present for your fight. Now, if we were to place this shock subphase in the second half of the fight camp, any adaptations that might arise probably wouldn't present themselves until after your fight, and that's really no use to us. So go ahead and label up the training weeks according to the subphase that they fall in. And as you can see here, the training weeks in the developmental subphase are called DEV for development, and the training weeks in the shock subphase are called SHK or shock, abbreviated. Again, make sure to draw in the training difficulty lines before we move on, and I'm going to assume that you're doing that, and I'm going to move on to the next phase and the last phase. Okay, so the next thing I recommend doing is going to the beginning of your fight plan. That's the beginning of the fight specific phase. Now remember, if you're in this 3-month plan, it assumes that you or whoever you're working with is not a beginner and they have a solid, or you have a solid base of conditioning. For this reason, the first 4 weeks of the 3-month plan schedule a developmental subphase featuring a 4-to-1 loading plan with the training difficulty around medium to high to start with. Now, this ultimately progresses to a very high level of training difficulty by the end of that subphase. Now, the final recovery week, it's very important here as you need it to help dissipate fatigue before your fight camp. Now, an important thing to note here is that depending on your calendar, you may need to make adjustments to the loading plan in the fight specific phase depending upon how many weeks you have to play with. Maybe a 3-to-1 loading plan fits better for you here. You have a lot of flexibility at the end of the day to do this in the fight specific phase, but I don't recommend adjusting anything in the fight camp or taper unless you are very confident in your understanding of periodization theory. So if you haven't already, I recommend that you pause the video and label up the training weeks and sketch out the training difficulty line as we're going to move on to concluding remarks here. Okay, so again, if you haven't already, the next thing that you should do is go back and label your training weeks appropriately. Developmental training weeks and recovery weeks belong in developmental subphases, and shock training weeks and recovery weeks belong in shock subphases. Also, number your subphases from left to right. Again, all of this will help later on when you're referring to where you're at in your training log. Also, make sure you draw your training difficulty line across the fight plan as I've done, as this will help in the next session when we're plotting the difficulty of our individual training sessions. Okay, let's get back to that slideshow. Okay, I am sure that you'll agree that when you don't plan out your training difficulty in advance, you have a tendency to train too hard and too often, and this will lead to overtraining. But when you take our approach, which does involve a little bit of heavy lifting with some key concepts in periodization theory, you're able to sketch out your training difficulty across your fight plan, and this will reduce your risk of overtraining because it gives you an idea of how and when and how often and how hard you should be working in those sessions. Now, when you have this drawn out, you can simply put it on your wall and coordinate with your coach. Let them know that you have a recovery week next week, but also you need to let them know that you have a shock week coming up and they should be prepared to push you in that training week. Now, this type of communication, it really does make a big difference, and it all starts with an organized fight plan. So let's leave it there for this session. Next time, we're going to show you how to program your individual training sessions across the fight plan. So take care until then.